Hey everyone, and welcome to Creative Writing at HIES. So I wanted to give you an overview of how this class is going to work. While sometimes this is going to be like a traditional English class where you read something for homework and then we talk about it the next day in class, at other times this will be very different. It's primarily a writing class, and while writing is something that you have to start on your own, it's something that improves over time and with constructive feedback from several readers. The rationale behind this class is we're all working to create something, we all take it seriously, and all of us have something to learn. Okay, that's great, but how do you give feedback, and how do you know if what I've written is good or not? Most creative writing classrooms for the past several decades have followed a workshop model that goes like this. The student who is up next submits a poem or short story the week before a workshop. Prior to that workshop class, the other students read it and make notes. During the workshop, the student artist sits and listens but does not talk as his or her classmates, led by the teacher, workshop the artist's story or poem. You say what works, what needs work, what were your reactions, etc. The artist may take notes but cannot respond. Everyone talks about his or her story as if the artist is not there. When the workshop is nearly over, the instructor asks the student if he or she has anything to say or add, and the student then gets to respond. I'm not going to do that. There are a couple of reasons for this. A workshop is a place where something that is broken is fixed. This presupposes the idea that a student's short story or poem is broken and needs to be fixed. When students write creatively, their work becomes much more personal to them, and so they take criticism much more personally. If I grade an academic paper of yours and I tell you what's wrong with it and you get a low C, you might be frustrated or annoyed, but that's because your grade's been affected or you're thinking about all the work you've got to do. If you write a poem and I act like it's broken, and I critique it the same way I critique a paper, you might react like I've just ripped your heart out of your chest, taken a bite of it, and then told you it tastes disgusting. Okay, maybe that's a little unnecessarily vivid, but this is a creative writing class. I want to avoid that kind of reaction at all costs. Tearing one another down doesn't help, and that starts with naming the process. So workshop, we're going to get away from that. I will undoubtedly slip up every once in a while and use the term because that's what I called it for years when I was in creative writing classes. But I'll avoid using that word as much as possible. Okay, the idea of the student artist staying silent during the workshop process, that's to encourage listening and to not get into defensive discussions and arguments with classmates. No, you've got it all wrong. It's about the patriarchy and its inherent flaws. Can't you see that? Well, what I meant to say, using the metaphor of the orchid, is that love is fleeting. Now, there is some value in not talking and listening. Listening is powerful, and throttling your defensive instincts can sometimes allow you to hear truly constructive criticism and not waste people's time with what you meant to say. But this is highly artificial, and it presupposes that the student artist is an argumentative bundle of nerves who's got to be sidelined so everyone can talk about the student's work as if he or she isn't there, even though the student is sitting right there next to you. I've also run workshops where everyone really loved a student short story. In one case, this young woman had written a short story. It was really strong. The ending was not great, but there were a lot of suggestions, thoughtful suggestions made about how the ending could be improved in a whole lot of different ways. So I thought it was really, really good feedback. And it wasn't like you must end it this way. Other students said maybe if you did this or you could try that, and all of these different things would fit. You just have to decide what you think would work. But here's why the current ending isn't as strong as it could be. I thought it was a great class, so I turned to the student at the end of it and said, okay, now it's your time to talk. Do you have any comments you'd like to make? And her response was, no, thank you. She felt that the story had been savagely ripped apart by her classmates, and keeping quiet the entire time had just led her to not listen to any of the critiques they were making. All she heard was, "Your story stinks," and so her resentment built. That's one of the flaws with this model, and it's one reason we're not going to use it. Workshops are run by artisans, master craftspeople who have years of experience in their given field. When I need my shoes repaired, I take them to my shoe repair guy. I know he's going to do a good job because he's been there for years, and I've got years of experience of him fixing my shoes. But students in creative writing workshops don't have a lot of experience with this sort of thing. So what usually happens is people end up deferring to the teacher, who presumably does have some experience and expertise. I'm not saying that I don't, but it's just as important that you learn how to critique each other's work, because again, we can learn from each other. When courses like this gravitate towards the instructor, who really becomes the sage on the stage, those courses end up becoming indoctrinations into that particular instructor's tastes. The class becomes this long session in loving what the instructor loves and hating what the instructor hates. Now, I'm as guilty of that as anyone. During pre-planning this year, I made a comment about how everything has literary value, except the Twilight novels. And I got some laughs for that. Thing is, I've never actually read any of those books. I've only seen the first movie, and that was on a plane, and my wife and I were watching. We didn't have headphones, and so watching it silently was rather bizarre and involved a whole lot of Edward and Bella staring at each other. To the mortification of our children, my wife and I started supplying voices. "You're so pale." "No, you're so pale." "You're the palest one of all." So I can make fun of things as much as anyone. However, I'm not the ultimate arbiter of taste. And one of you may love the Twilight novels and want to write something like that. That's great. I'm wise enough to know that there are a whole lot of books out there that might not be my cup of tea. That doesn't make them any less valuable. So that's the kind of story that you want to write. Go for it. We are going to follow a different model. First, I'll be open about what I value in art and storytelling. The purpose of art, that's a hard thing to define, but I've got one that works, and I use this in my other classes too. So the purpose of art, and in our case we're talking about fiction and poetry, is to communicate an experience. That's number one. Number two, I tend to focus slightly more on fiction and narrative than on poetry because I write fiction. However, I love poetry, I teach poetry, and I hope I have something to offer you about poetry. So if you like to write poetry more than you like to write fiction, great, you're very welcome. I'm just trying to be upfront about what my own biases are. But I'm not going to require all poets to write only narrative. And I think that narrative writers and poets have a lot to learn from each other in terms of writing. Okay. Continuing with fiction, 3. Fiction does its work by creating a dream in a reader's mind. For that dream to be powerful, it needs to be vivid and continuous. And anything that drops us out of that dream is to be avoided. I'll add caveats for metafiction and some other things. I'll talk more about that in class. 4. Language is to be valued. Carelessness, sloppiness, and ignorance with regards to writing is to be banished. But this does not mean that I'm going to banish you from class if you write a comma splice or something. This is a goal to aim for, not a requirement upon pain of death. 5. Show, don't tell. That's pretty old advice for creative writing. I'm going to modify it slightly. Show more than you tell. Sometimes telling, simply saying this happened, can be very valuable and is very useful when you're writing fiction and poetry. But showing it can be more vivid and more continuous and more effective. I'll talk more about that in class too. Last, pretty basic concrete advice. Avoid adverbs. Seriously, you don't need 90+% of them. If you finished on Writing by Stephen King over the summer, he talks about that pretty extensively. She shouted loudly. Is there another way to shout? You don't need the loudly. If you don't like shouted, then say something like she bellowed or she screamed. Pick a better verb. Most of the time, they'll be a lot more valuable than using adverbs. So instead of using the term workshop, I'm going to use the term writing lab to describe those class sessions where we sit and talk about student work. Writing lab is a deliberate term. A laboratory is a place where you experiment, where you try things. And a lot of times in laboratories, experiments fail, but those failures aren't necessarily bad. In fact, they can be quite good. I had a friend who was a chemist who worked in the chemistry lab, and his company was trying to develop a polymer to put on the surface of military vehicles, I think, to make them more bulletproof or protective. And he said that they went through something like 150 different types of polymers before they found one that worked. And I said, my gosh, that must have taken a long time. It must have been discouraging. And they had 150 failures. And he said, no, they weren't failures. Every time it didn't work, we just sort of crossed that off and said, okay, well, that doesn't work in this way. Don't do that again. Okay? That's sort of how I want to take a look at writing labs for us. The way I want to structure writing lab days is based in part in this process developed by a woman named Liz Lerman. Liz Lerman is a choreographer, performer, writer, teacher, and speaker. Pretty impressive. She developed something called a critical response process. It's a method designed for giving and getting feedback in any kind of artistic work and process, whether it is choreographing a dance, writing a poem, painting, putting on a musical, baking a cake. It's designed to leave the maker eager and motivated to get back to work. The process assigns one of 3 roles to every participant. There's the artist. That's the student who submits a work in progress for review and feels prepared to question that work in a dialogue with others. The second role is the responder. Responders are committed to the artist's intent to make excellent work, and they offer reactions to the work in a dialogue with the artist. And the third role is the facilitator. The facilitator initiates each step, keeps the process on track, and works to help the artist and responders to use the process to frame useful questions and responses. The creative response process has 4 steps. The first is statements of meaning. Responders state what was meaningful, evocative, interesting, exciting, or striking in the work they just read. The second is the artist as questioner. The artist asks questions about the work. After each question, the responders answer. Step 3 are neutral questions. Responders ask neutral questions about the work, and the artist responds. Step 4 is opinion time. Responders state opinions, subject to permission from the artist. You can follow this process in a bit more detail on a PDF link that I'll have on the class website. So that's a brief overview of the creative writing class. The response process that I was talking about is going to be something we learn more by doing than reading about, but I want to give you a brief taste. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to seeing you, seeing what you create. In the meantime, be well, do good work, and wash your hands.